She sat in silence, showing almost no visible reaction as the families of the victims spoke during the court hearing in Pennsylvania. She did not offer a long explanation, and she did not give a detailed defense of her actions. To the outside world, Pressdee was a nurse. She was someone families were supposed to trust. She worked in long-term care facilities, where vulnerable residents depended on staff for nearly everything. Her defense team argued that Pressdee's actions were driven by a misguided desire to spare her patients from suffering. Attorney James DePasquale explicitly stated she felt sorry for these people and she was trying to alleviate their suffering. At first, the defense argument seemed reasonable. The jury considered it, but then prosecutors introduced multiple layers of evidence and everything changed. What you are about to see is the moment Heather Pressdee realized that her version of the story could not stand against the evidence. Multiple patients died within nursing homes, rehabilitation facilities, and long-term care centers across western Pennsylvania. The events unfolded quietly, and the evidence of what really happened came from medical data, work schedules, insulin records, witness testimony, disciplinary history, and personal text messages. This became one of the most disturbing and difficult to accept cases in recent years, and also one of the cases involving one of the heaviest prison sentences ever imposed in the United States. And every detail you are about to see has been verified through court records, law enforcement investigations, courtroom testimony, and the jury's sentencing decision. If you have never heard this story before, prepare yourself, because what happened across western Pennsylvania from 2020 to 2023 will challenge everything you think about nursing homes, rehabilitation facilities, and long-term care centers. To understand why Heather Pressdee ended up in that courtroom and why she was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences for 3 counts of first-degree murder, plus 380 to 760 years for 19 counts of attempted murder, we need to understand the full timeline of the case and the lives of the people involved before the crimes came to light. Here are all the important details of this case. You should not skip ahead while watching, so you do not miss any key information. Heather Pressdee was born on the 28th of August, 1982. She grew up in Natrona Heights, Pennsylvania, north of Pittsburgh, where she lived with her mother. Before completing her nursing credentials, she worked for about 14 years as a veterinary technician. In that role, she assisted with animal euthanasia. Some criminal experts have later speculated that this work may have influenced how she thought about suffering, medical intervention, and control over life-ending decisions. However, that remains an interpretation, not a proven legal conclusion. Pressdee eventually became a registered nurse in Pennsylvania. Before her arrest, she worked within the long-term care system in western Pennsylvania, including nursing homes, rehabilitation facilities, and centers that cared for residents who depended heavily on staff. Many of those residents were elderly, medically fragile, or unable to fully protect themselves. In that setting, nurses were trusted with medication, medical charts, treatment schedules, and close access to patients during their most vulnerable moments. Beginning in 2018, Pressdee worked at several different care facilities across western Pennsylvania, but according to prosecutors and reporting from AP News, her employment history was unstable. She often worked at facilities for short periods of time. Records later showed that she had been disciplined for inappropriate conduct, abusive behavior, or poor treatment toward patients and coworkers. In multiple instances, she either resigned or was terminated from her positions. That background became important once the case came to light. A nurse inside a nursing home is not just another employee. She may have access to medication rooms, insulin supplies, patient records, and information about a resident's medical condition. For older adults and seriously ill patients, that access requires trust, restraint, and professional responsibility. Because of that, the shock surrounding the case was not based only on the number of victims. It was also rooted in the reversal of Pressdee's role. Families believed their loved ones were being placed in care environments meant to protect them. Instead, prosecutors would later say that a person trusted with their care became a source of danger. That contrast became one of the central reasons the case drew such intense attention across Pennsylvania and beyond. From a psychological perspective, the Heather Pressdee case was not presented as a sudden outburst or a single failure in judgment. Prosecutors described it as a repeated pattern that stretched across years, several care facilities, many patients, and different work shifts. That pattern is what made the case especially difficult for investigators and families to accept. The conduct did not occur in one isolated room or during one brief moment. It moved through the long-term care system, where vulnerable residents depended on medical staff for medication, monitoring, and basic safety. According to prosecutors, Pressdee used high or potentially dangerous doses of insulin on 22 patients at 5 care facilities across 4 Pennsylvania counties. The victims ranged in age from 43 to 104. Prosecutors said at least 17 patients who had been under Pressdee's care died between 2020 and 2023. The facilities connected to the case included Concordia at Rebecca Residence, Belair Healthcare and Rehabilitation, Quality Life Services, Chicora, Premier Armstrong Rehabilitation and Nursing Center, and Sunnyview Rehabilitation and Nursing Center. On the 2nd of November 2023, authorities announced expanded charges, saying Pressdee was accused of harming 19 additional patients at multiple facilities. The method described by investigators centered on insulin. For some diabetic patients, insulin is a necessary medication, but when it is given in excessive amounts, especially to patients who do not need it, it can cause blood sugar to drop to dangerous levels and create a life-threatening medical crisis. According to the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office, Pressdee was accused of administering excessive insulin to both diabetic and non-diabetic patients. One detail prosecutors emphasized was timing. Many of the incidents, they said, occurred during overnight shifts, when fewer staff members were present and supervision could be more limited. That detail supported the prosecution's argument that this was not simply a medical error, but a pattern involving opportunity and selected timing. As for motive, public records do not point to money or a personal dispute with each victim. Instead, prosecutors focused on themes of power, control, contempt for patients, and the misuse of medical authority. Coworkers reportedly described Pressdee as someone who often showed disdain toward patients and made insulting comments about them. Psychologically, the case represents a severe distortion of the caregiving role. A nurse is trusted to reduce suffering, provide support, and protect people who may not be able to protect themselves. In this case, prosecutors said Pressdee used her medical knowledge, access to medication, and position inside care facilities to harm the very people placed under her care. That reversal of duty is why the case is often described as a medical serial offender case, meaning a series of crimes committed inside spaces where patients and families expected safety, dignity, and professional care. From a psychological perspective, the Heather Pressdee case was not presented as a sudden outburst or a single failure in judgment. Prosecutors described it as a repeated pattern that stretched across years, several care facilities, many patients, and different work shifts. That pattern is what made the case especially difficult for investigators and families to accept. The conduct did not occur in one isolated room or during one brief moment. It moved through the long-term care system, where vulnerable residents depended on medical staff for medication, monitoring, and basic safety. At first, the cases connected to Heather Pressdee could have appeared to be separate medical complications. Many of the patients were elderly, seriously ill, or living in long-term care facilities where sudden decline was not always unexpected. In that environment, a resident becoming weak, being transferred for emergency care, or even dying might not immediately be treated as a sign of criminal conduct. Families trusted that the facilities were responding to medical needs, and staff members were expected to document changes through the normal procedures of patient care. Over time, however, unusual patterns began to raise concern. Patients were declining after periods of care connected to Pressdee, and some of those incidents involved insulin, a medication that can be medically necessary for certain diabetic patients, but dangerous when used improperly. The case began to take shape when authorities focused on several specific incidents at Quality Life Services Chicora, a skilled nursing facility in Chicora, Pennsylvania. In May 2023, Pressdee was initially charged in connection with the deaths of 2 patients and the injury of a 3rd patient after insulin had allegedly been administered. CBS Pittsburgh reported that the early charges centered on insulin doses that were described as fatal or potentially fatal at that care facility. That filing marked a turning point. What may have first looked like isolated medical events was now being examined as a criminal case. From there, investigators began widening the scope. Authorities reviewed other facilities where Pressdee had worked, compared her shift history with patient emergencies, and examined medication records, blood sugar events, and cases involving unexplained decline. They also looked for similarities among patients who became critically ill or died after care connected to her. The important point is that this case was not uncovered through one single dramatic moment, the way some family homicide cases begin with a 911 call. It emerged through a more difficult process of connecting medical records, staff schedules, pharmacy information, and repeated clinical concerns across multiple facilities. Investigators had to determine whether the pattern could be explained by illness, coincidence, medication error, or something intentional. That process made the case especially complex. In long-term care settings, many residents already have serious health conditions. For prosecutors, the challenge was to show that the repeated insulin-related events were not simply tragic medical outcomes, but part of a broader pattern tied to the same nurse, the same type of medication, and the same vulnerable patient population. Because this case unfolded inside medical and long-term care settings, investigators were not dealing with one traditional crime scene. The evidence was spread across several nursing homes and care facilities in Allegheny, Armstrong, Butler, and Westmoreland counties in Pennsylvania. According to AP News, the case involved 5 care facilities and patients who were under Pressdee's care between 2020 and 2023. That meant investigators had to reconstruct events across different buildings, different employers, different patient records, and different work shifts. The first layer of evidence came from medical records. Investigators reviewed each patient's condition before Pressdee cared for them, their medication history, whether insulin had been ordered, blood sugar readings, and the medical decline that followed. For patients who were not diabetic or who had no clear medical order for insulin, those records became especially important. They helped investigators determine whether the insulin use could be explained by treatment or whether it fell outside normal care. The second layer involved work schedules and shift records. Prosecutors said many of the excessive insulin events happened during overnight shifts, when fewer staff members were present and direct supervision could be limited. By comparing the timing of patient emergencies with Pressdee's shifts, investigators were able to identify a recurring pattern. That comparison helped move the case away from isolated medical complications and toward a broader criminal investigation. The third layer focused on insulin itself. Authorities reviewed when insulin was administered, who had access to it, which patients received it, and whether the dosage made medical sense. In a medical case like this, that distinction is critical. Prosecutors had to separate possible treatment errors from disease-related complications and from actions they believed were intentional. The fourth layer came from coworkers and facility staff. According to AP News, colleagues had questioned Pressdee's conduct multiple times and described her as showing contempt toward patients. Some reported that she made insulting comments about residents in her care. Those statements helped prosecutors build a picture of her attitude toward vulnerable patients and the workplace environment around her. The fifth layer involved personal text messages. Court records showed that Pressdee had messaged her mother about frustrations with patients and coworkers, and some messages reportedly included comments about possibly harming them. For prosecutors, those messages were not just background details. They helped show Pressdee's state of mind, her awareness, and the way she talked privately about people who depended on her care. Taken together, the case was not built on one piece of evidence. It was built through the connection of medical data, shift records, medication access, witness statements, disciplinary history, and personal messages. That combination allowed investigators to argue that what happened was not a series of unrelated medical events, but a pattern that followed Pressdee across multiple care facilities. Heather Pressdee became a suspect when authorities began finding overlap between unusual patient emergencies and her work history at care facilities in western Pennsylvania. At first, the case focused on 3 patients. 2 had died, and a third had been seriously harmed after insulin was allegedly administered. Those early charges gave investigators a starting point, but they did not end the inquiry. Instead, they pushed authorities to look beyond one facility and examine whether similar medical events had followed Pressdee at other workplaces. Pressdee was arrested in May 2023. According to news reports, after the initial charges were filed, her nursing license was suspended. That suspension reflected the seriousness of the allegations and the need to remove her from any position where she could have access to patients or medication while the criminal case moved forward. During the investigation and questioning process, the central issue was intent. Insulin is a lawful and necessary medication in many medical settings, especially for diabetic patients. But when it is given to the wrong patient, in the wrong amount, or without a valid medical order, it can become extremely dangerous. Investigators had to determine whether the insulin events were treatment errors, medical complications, or deliberate acts. On the 2nd of November 2023, authorities announced expanded charges. Pressdee was accused of harming 19 additional patients at 5 care facilities. ABC7 reported that authorities said Pressdee had admitted attempting to harm those additional patients with insulin. The expanded charges showed that investigators did not view the case as one isolated clinical mistake. They saw it as a repeated pattern across multiple locations. For prosecutors, The key issue was not only that Pressdee was present during unusual medical events. She also had access to medication, shift records that aligned with patient crises, and personal messages that, according to investigators, reflected frustration and troubling attitudes toward patients and coworkers. Heather Pressdee did not go through a full jury trial because she chose to plead guilty. Even so, the case still involved several important court proceedings, especially the plea and sentencing hearing held in Butler County, Pennsylvania, on the 2nd of May 2024. By that point, the investigation had already expanded far beyond the original charges, and the courtroom had become the place where the full scope of the case was formally placed into the public record. During that hearing, Pressdee pleaded guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder and 19 counts of attempted murder. The charges were connected to fatal or potentially fatal doses of insulin given to 22 patients at care facilities across 4 Pennsylvania counties. The patients were people who had been placed in nursing homes, rehabilitation centers, and long-term care settings where families believed they would receive supervision, medication management, and professional care. Because Pressdee entered a guilty plea, the case did not include jury deliberations or a jury verdict in the way a full trial would have. For that reason, there is no public record of jurors questioning Pressdee, weighing evidence in open court, or issuing formal comments about her and the victims. The legal outcome came through her plea, not through a contested trial decided by a jury. Instead, the most emotional part of the hearing came from the victim impact statements and the arguments presented in court. According to AP News, many relatives of the victims spoke during the sentencing hearing. Some said Pressdee had placed herself in the position of deciding whether vulnerable patients should live or die. Their statements made clear that many families did not see the case as an act of mercy, but as a profound betrayal of trust inside places meant to provide care. Pressdee's defense strategy focused largely on avoiding the death penalty. According to AP News, her defense attorneys worked with prosecutors toward a plea that would remove that possibility. The guilty plea became the key part of that legal strategy. Some reports also noted that in an earlier court appearance, in February 2024, Pressdee argued with her attorney and expressed a desire to plead guilty. In general, the defense did not center on denying every act. It focused on managing the legal consequences, avoiding a capital sentence, and resolving the case through life imprisonment. At the plea hearing, Pressdee's admission was brief. When asked why she was pleading guilty, she answered, "Because I am guilty." The sentence was short, but it carried the weight of the entire case. It confirmed in open court that she was accepting legal responsibility for the charges before her. According to AP News, while relatives of the victims addressed the court, Pressdee did not look at them and showed little visible reaction. Some family members described her in severe terms, reflecting the anger and grief felt inside the courtroom. For a documentary script, that moment is powerful because it was not loud or theatrical. It was the quiet contrast between one woman's brief admission and the lasting pain of many families who had come to court to speak for people who could no longer speak for themselves. On the 2nd of May 2024, in Butler County, Pennsylvania, Heather Pressdee was sentenced after entering her guilty plea. The sentence formally closed the criminal case against her at the trial court level and confirmed the scale of the charges tied to patients across multiple care facilities. The sentence included 3 consecutive life terms for 3 counts of first-degree murder. In addition, Pressdee received another 380 to 760 years in prison for 19 counts of attempted murder. The case involved 22 victims at care facilities across 4 counties in Pennsylvania. AP News and CBS Pittsburgh both confirmed the sentence and the scope of the convictions. According to AP News, Pressdee could have faced the possibility of the death penalty. Her guilty plea allowed her to avoid that outcome. Even so, the punishment she received was effectively a sentence that ensured she would not return to free society. 3 consecutive life sentences, combined with hundreds of additional years, left no realistic path back to ordinary life outside prison. The legal outcome also sent a clear message about how seriously the court viewed the case. These were not treated as isolated treatment errors, documentation mistakes, or ordinary medical complications. The sentence reflected the number of victims, the repeated nature of the conduct, and the setting in which it occurred. Care facilities where patients and families expected safety, supervision, and professional responsibility. Although the criminal case reached its formal conclusion at sentencing, the impact did not end there. The families of the victims were left with grief and unanswered questions. The care facilities connected to the case faced lasting scrutiny. And for the public, the case raised deeper concerns about trust, oversight, and the protection of vulnerable patients in long-term care settings. The Heather Pressdee case remains one of the most troubling medical crime cases in Pennsylvania in recent years. Its seriousness did not come only from the number of victims, but from the setting where the crimes occurred. These patients were not harmed in an alley, on a street, or by a stranger they encountered by chance. They were harmed inside care facilities, places where families had sent their loved ones with the belief that they would be monitored, protected, and treated with dignity. Heather Pressdee was not an outsider to those environments. She was a trained nurse with access to medication, patient charts, medical routines, and vulnerable residents. That access made her actions especially dangerous. The case showed how misconduct inside a care setting can remain quiet, clinical, and difficult to detect when the person responsible understands the system, the medication, and the routines of the facility. What made the case even harder for families was the trust that had been placed in the profession itself. A nursing home is supposed to be a place of supervision and safety. A rehabilitation center is supposed to help patients recover or stabilize. A long-term care facility is supposed to protect people who can no longer fully protect themselves. In this case, prosecutors said that trust was violated in one of the most serious ways possible. The largest message from this case is clear: trust in healthcare must always be supported by oversight. No facility should rely only on a job title, a professional license, or the assumption that a caregiver is safe simply because they wear a uniform or hold medical credentials. Trust matters, but trust without accountability can leave vulnerable patients exposed. In this case, warning signs appeared in different forms. There was a history of workplace discipline. There were reports of negative comments toward patients. There were patients who declined after certain shifts. There were unusual medication patterns that later became part of the investigation. Each detail may have seemed separate at first, but together they formed a pattern that demanded serious review. The case also reminds viewers that elderly patients, seriously ill residents, and people living in nursing homes are not people whose lives have lost value. They still have the right to safety, medical care, dignity, and respect until the end of their lives. Their dependence on others should never make them invisible. The first lesson is for families. When a loved one is living in a care facility, unusual changes should be taken seriously. Unexplained low blood sugar, sudden decline after a specific shift, medication changes that are not clearly explained, repeated emergency transfers, or vague answers from staff can all deserve closer attention. Asking questions is not disrespectful. In many cases, it is part of protecting someone who may not be able to speak fully for themselves. The second lesson is for care facilities. Complaints about staff must be documented, reviewed, and acted on when necessary. An unstable work history, insulting behavior toward patients, repeated clinical concerns, or unusual patient outcomes should never be dismissed as minor internal problems. In long-term care, patterns matter. The final lesson is for society. Vulnerable people need both compassion and strong systems of protection. When a patient is too weak, too ill, or too dependent to advocate for themselves, the responsibility grows for families, co-workers, administrators, regulators, and the legal system. The Pressdee case shows that safety cannot depend on trust alone. It must be protected through vigilance, documentation, communication, and accountability.